Good afternoon, everyone. So lovely to have you with us and joining us in our In Focus today. It's supporting recovery after trauma, how a learning community can lead through protective practice. My name's Ruth. I'm the National Senior Clinical Project Officer in the BU team at Headspace. I'm a social worker by background, and I've been working in mental health for a little over 10 years. I moved into the BU space about a year ago, and I've just been floored by the incredible work that's being done in our learning communities, but also the crucial role that they play in the mental health and wellbeing of our young people. Just before we begin, if you haven't attended a session like this before, you'll notice that you won't be able to use your mic or webcam. You're in listen-only mode, and that's due to the larger number of attendees online today. You're definitely able to ask questions or leave comments in the chat box or question box, and you can just see some of those features there that we've got on the slide there. And don't forget, if you do have any technical difficulties, please feel free to call 1800 270 911. So just before we begin, we can go to the third slide. Thanks. I'd like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the traditional owners on the lands on which we meet. I'm sitting on the ancestral lands of the Kaurna people of the Adelaide Plains. I know you're joining us from all across the country today, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge and value their deep and real connection to land, kin, waters and community. If you'd like to, and if you're feeling like you can, please feel free to write in the chat box the name of the traditional lands that you're joining us from today. It's really interesting to get a picture of where everyone's joining us from. So, as I mentioned earlier, learning communities can play such an important role in the wellbeing of children, young people and their families. I think this has really come to fore over the last 12 months as our country has endured bushfires, ongoing droughts and a global pandemic. Today, we're looking at how the learning community can support recovery following a community trauma. I'm really honoured to introduce our subject matter experts today from Emerging Minds, Brad Morgan and Ben Rogers, and my colleague from Headspace working in the BU Bushfire Recovery Program, Heidi Yelland. Brad is a director at Emerging Minds. He leads the establishment and delivery of the National Workforce Centre for Child Mental Health. He's an occupational therapist and has worked extensively in workforce development and strategy. Ben Rogers is also an occupational therapist and is currently the manager of community trauma at Emerging Minds. He works with the BU Bushfire Response Program to support learning communities following the devastating 2019 and 2020 bushfires. Heidi Yelland is a contact liaison officer for the BU Bushfire Response Program and works with the Headspace BU team. Heidi has been an educator for 25 years and has worked in a range of leadership and wellbeing positions. So we're really thrilled to have all three of you join us today. Thank you for giving up your time and expertise to join us. So I did just mention earlier that for those of you who have just joined us, you can submit a question via the question or chat box on your control panel. We won't be unfortunately able to get to all questions, and we're only really able to give kind of general answers to questions, not able to give specific responses to individual trauma cases. And please don't feel like we can't, that you won't get your question answered. We will, any questions that we can't answer today, we will follow up and get those to you in the post-webinar handout. So before we kick off to the official kind of part of today, I think it's really important, and I'd like to take a moment to remember that whenever we're talking about mental health in any context, especially trauma, it can affect us in different ways. As educators, you all come with your own unique experiences, and if there's anything we cover today that may raise uncomfortable feelings, please feel free to opt out of the session or just take a break if you need to. I really just want to remind you that please to reach out to your own support network if that's necessary. A reminder about your employee assistance program, and of course, please contact any of the services on this infographic. Today's session will be recorded, so you'll be able to come back and watch it at a later stage. So some of you may be really familiar with BU. So BU is a national initiative and it looks at supporting the mental health of children and young people from birth to 18 years. BU is an initiative that is delivered by Beyond Blue, and it's in collaboration with Early Childhood Australia and Headspace. We really want to help you involve everyone at your early learning service or school in supporting mental health so that you can achieve the best possible outcomes. It's a great initiative. It's completely free, and you'll notice that, there's free interactive sessions such as the one today that you're a part of, but we also have accredited professional learnings that are available online, a number of fact sheets on a range of topics, and some really fantastic planning and implementation tools. Some of them I'll touch on later after the question and answer panel today. So our vision is really simple, but probably very aspirational, that every Australian early learning service and school is a positive, inclusive and resilient community where every child, young person, staff member and parent and carer can achieve their best possible outcome. What a lovely vision to start us off with today. So I think that's quite enough from me. I'm going to hand it over to Brad and Ben to run through the more formal part of today, today's In Focus. And then after their presentation, we'll jump into the question and answer panel with some questions that have come through from the chat box. So just a reminder, please put in your questions in the chat box and hopefully we might get to some of them, but just a reminder that they'll be revisited in the post webinar handout. So over to you, Brad.
Thanks, Ruth, and hi, everyone. So just to get started today, I thought I'd just introduce what we will be talking a bit about today. And as Ruth was saying, we really are looking at quite a big year for everyone in this country, but particularly for learning communities and for children and young people, with quite a number of series of events. So really what we're wanting to look at today is really look at the opportunities and the characteristics that education settings have to support children through a lot of these challenges that we've been going through. And then also to share some of the strategies and resources that are available for learning communities. And when we think about learning communities, we're looking at early child education and care settings, primary schools and secondary schools, and all of the different people involved in those communities. So really looking at how we can provide support, particularly around community trauma recovery. So just to highlight that we are going to be looking at, as I said, sort of the events that have happened this year, and not looking specifically at sort of individual family traumas or things like that children might experience, that are probably a bit more looking at things like abuse and neglect. That won't be what we'll be covering today. It's much more focused on, what's been happening. So I think just a bit of background behind Emerging Minds, where I come from, and really looking at our connection with the BU initiative. So I'm just going to the next slide. BU, as you know, sort of is really looking at education communities and supporting children's wellbeing and young people's wellbeing. And Emerging Minds is a national organisation that also is really looking at infant, child and young people's mental health. And one of the programs we're supported to lead from the Department of Health is a program called the National Workforce Centre for Child Mental Health. And these initiatives are really, I guess, operating in parallel and are quite linked. When we look at our work, it's really looking at services outside of the learning communities. So looking at health services, social services, community services. So the types of services outside the learning community that children and families are likely to come in contact with. And we both share a vision around how do we increase national awareness and support for infant, child and young people's mental health, and also in response to things like experiences of trauma and adversity as well. So I'll just move on to the next one, and looking at learning communities. So what we really wanted to highlight today is that learning communities, by their very nature, are protective and supportive of recovery. And I think something that's useful for us to remind ourselves of quite often is what nurtures good social and emotional wellbeing and development in children and young people is also what nurtures recovery from traumatic events and experiences. And something that's unique about learning communities is really, how I like to think of it, is they are a developmental context where children and young people spend a lot of time, and just the nature of that means where we spend lots of our time is really what shapes us in our mental health and development and our recovery as well. So what we really wanted to look at today and highlight to you, and I'm sure you're all aware, but just to really reinforce, is that you already are supporting recovery, and you are supporting social emotional wellbeing because of the nature of the learning community. Things that we know support social emotional wellbeing and recovery are things like having relationships and supportive relationships. In particular, in the learning community, is having adult relationships, someone who's looking out for us, who's thinking about us. We've got peer relationships that are there. The other component of learning communities is the structure and routines that they provide. They provide enormous amounts of security for children and young people, having some consistency in our routines and our daily lives. And the other place, I guess, important part of learning communities is that they are a place where there is an opportunity to be safe to express our emotions and how we're feeling as well. And so today we're really looking at lots of those different opportunities in these settings and how we can nurture them. So before we get too much into the content, I just wanted to highlight that we all have different levels of understanding and knowledge about trauma. Some of us have really deep levels of understanding. Some of us have sort of had some curiosity about it, and others sort of are just learning, just getting to know about it and hear about it. So before getting started, I just thought I'd share a video just to help us understand and be on the similar page about trauma.
As we sail through life, we might encounter events that are adverse or traumatic. A traumatic event is a deeply distressing or disturbing experience. A traumatic experience can happen directly to a person, or it can be something they have witnessed. A traumatic experience is likely to involve either loss of life or a threat to life, loss of liberty or a threat to liberty, abuse, including emotional, physical, sexual abuse or neglect, and physical harm or a threat of harm. The impact of trauma can be passed down from one generation to the next. Remember, not everyone will respond to a traumatic experience in the same way, and not everyone needs to be the subject of harm or abuse to be traumatized. A witness to trauma, such as a child in a home with family violence, can be impacted by trauma. A response to trauma is not always immediate and may be felt many years later. Adversity can be an event or experience that is distressing and worrying, a misfortune, or a significant change or loss, such as the death of a loved one. All of us experience adversity in our lives at some stage, and most of the time these do not cause lasting difficulties. However, ongoing adverse events, or a number of adversities over a number of years, which may not be considered traumatic in themselves, can have a cumulative negative impact on a developing child and may lead to a trauma response. Adult experiences of high levels of adversity can also impact on the child-parent relationship. Adversities come from the types of challenges that occur in life from time to time. They may occur within our homes, or they may come from outside events, such as financial crisis, natural disasters, loss of employment, or relationship breakdown. Trauma and adversity in childhood has been closely linked with negative physical, social, and mental health outcomes in childhood, adolescence, and adulthood.
So just before I hand over to Ben, I just wanted to acknowledge that video is available for you to use in your groups or learning communities as well, and it's freely available from Emerging Minds, which we'll go into a bit before. But I think it's also just to acknowledge the last 12 months, and I think that picture you saw at the end of that video with lots of little fish sort of chewing away at that boat, I think probably reflects what we've probably been experiencing, particularly for a lot of learning communities in Australia over the last 12 months with, we've had drought followed by bushfires and obviously the COVID situation as well. So I'll hand over to Ben, who's going to talk a bit more about opportunities to support children in the learning community.
Yeah, thanks, Brad, and thanks, Ruth. As you can see here, we've developed a visual representation of ways that you as an educator can support children following a community trauma. Having worked in learning communities, I've found that it can feel quite overwhelming for educators at times, knowing where to start when supporting children's mental health. And particularly what's been raised with me is this uncertainty of knowing exactly what's within your scope as an educator. And so we know there's a lot of great programs and services out there that can support children, but what we're interested in today is the daily interactions that you have with children and the things that you can do in the learning context to support their recovery. And as part of that process, I'll talk about some practical ways, I think, as an OT, and really want to come back to the ways that you can support your day-to-day functioning as an educator. But also, we want to shine a light on the things that you're doing well. But also, this visual representation can provide a bit of a framework to help guide you through the process. So we'll start off, I'll look at staff wellbeing initially and the importance of looking after yourselves. We'll look at daily approaches. We'll look at how you can monitor children when you're feeling like there's some vulnerabilities, and then looking at activating support as well. So next slide. Now, before we dive into this, I want to take a moment to talk about regulation. And some of you may be aware of this term regulation, but I find that the window of tolerance is a nice way of helping to understand what happens before and after a community trauma or traumatic experience. So let's just cast our eyes over to the left-hand side for a moment, where we have a nervous system with a nice wide kind of green zone where we're quite regulated in that green zone. Hopefully that's how most of you are feeling today watching this webinar. It's when we're in a state of balance. Our prefrontal cortex, our thinking brain is online, and we're able to think, to reason, reflect, and importantly, socially engage with those around us. But at times, naturally, we can move into a hypoaroused state, so an under-responsive system where we can start to feel more zoned out, more spacey, and in terms of extreme stress, we can move into a shutdown response as well. And then the dreaded red zone that everyone talks about, that's when we're in a hypoaroused state where the amygdala, the limbic system kind of area of the brain takes over, and the fuel that's pumped through our body is that cortisol and adrenaline. And certain behaviors that we might show when we're in those states, and we all can relate to this when we're feeling heightened. We're edgier, more agitated and reactive and things like that. But let's just take a moment to think about the concept of the window of tolerance, because our nervous system's built in a way to tolerate things and daily stresses. So it might be a tricky conversation you've had with a parent. It might be some challenging behavior in the classroom, or even just, the dreaded feeling of after lunch lessons when the kids are bouncing off the walls. Naturally, our nervous system's built to have a threshold or window that can tolerate these things. But what happens as part of a community trauma is that our number one operating system in our body, our nervous system, is around safety. And when it's questioned, like in a community trauma, it can have really significant impact on the stress levels which happen over a sustained period of time. And so I think this is really important for us to just stop and think about for a moment, because with community trauma, our whole kind of questioning of safety in our body is changed, and it's really hard for it to switch off. And what happens over a period of time is the body's filled with a state of toxic stress, which narrowly shortens or shrinks our window of tolerance. And this is a very complex neurological process, but hopefully it can understand why, particularly the stress of this year, thinking about invisible virus that's kind of cast over our communities, as well as bushfires and other kind of floods and community traumas, why this concept is so important for us to take note of. And I'm going to just reference this as we go along to help make sense of it a little bit more. So we'll go next slide. So staff wellbeing, it's a big area, a very important area for us to take note of at the moment. The learning community is a crucial hub for children and young people as part of the recovery process. We know that children and young people naturally attune to the emotions of key adults around them. Even for you listening to the sound of my voice and looking at my facial expressions, you're resonating and feeling something yourself, even through watching a webinar. And I think this is really important, that we don't have to say words to resonate how we're actually feeling. It's through our affect, our tone of voice, our body posture. And kids and young people really do pick this up. And this can be a great thing, I think, when we're feeling regulated and in that green zone where we can naturally co-regulate with those around us. But I think where this can have some detrimental effects is when we're in that heightened state, that red zone that I referenced before, where kids and young people can naturally feel that as well. And particularly, you know, we know that in order to provide a safe, secure and supportive environment, which we know is so important for children in recovery, it's really important that you find ways of looking after yourself. And as I said, this is a really important topic area, and BU actually had a webinar that was released last month in this, if you're curious to learn in more depth. But just to touch on this for a moment, the first thing you can really try is check in with yourself throughout the day. So notice if you are increasing in your arousal at all and moving into that red zone, and to find ways or self-care access points where you can use to help regulate yourself. And I think this is a key thing, isn't it, around self-care, because self-care can often be looked at as a segment in your day. So, you know, I go for my walk in the morning, or I might go to the gym in the afternoon. But if we can find those, and they're very important aspects of self-care, definitely. But if we can find those micro moments in our day to alleviate that stress, to regulate ourselves, it can have a lasting impact for us. And a good way of thinking about this at a visual representation is thinking of stress, our own stress, like a cup. And throughout the day, it kind of floods in, and to the point where on those very extremely stressful days, it overflows and we become really heightened. And if we can find those moments in the day to take a deep breath, to find a tool that can regulate us, it can have a big impact. I know for me, a beacon for me is noticing tightness in my chest when I'm becoming stressed. And I use getting a drink of water as a very kind of practical point to check in with myself. And sometimes I might be filling up my drink bottle and notice that tightness and just take a couple of deep breaths, which can help ground me. So take a moment now before we go on to the next slide to think about what they are for you, but also to acknowledge that there's supports in place that can help you with that work, whether that's colleagues or family or ongoing supports through mental health services. So let's look at daily approaches, and I'm sure you're all curious about this. You know, what can I do as an educator to support children? And I guess I want to start with that point of relationships. And relationships, we all know, are so important. Connection is a key component of supporting children following a community trauma. And for many children, it's the changes in their family context that have really lasting impacts on them following a natural disaster or a trauma, community trauma. It's the parental separation, it's the financial stress, it's the moving house. And we know that educators have a really important role in being a consistent person for children, young people, a person that can listen, can acknowledge their experiences, a person who can validate how they're feeling. And I just really want to take note of those interactions and acknowledge they may seem small, but those interactions you have with children and just being a presence in their life really does impact their psychological and physiological well-being. And often when I talk to educators about this, it's that kind of that feeling that it's a struggle to really get to all the kids in the classroom and knowing where to start with this kind of approach. One thing I've found really useful is the 2x10 principle. And this is an approach where if you're having any challenges with a child in the classroom or you're struggling to connect with a child, spending 2 minutes for 10 days in a row, just pull up a chair for that 2 minutes and follow the conversation with the child. So follow their lead in wherever they take it. And that might seem unusual at first, is why would, that's quite unusual to follow the child's lead. But by positioning them as the expert of their own life, they can take you on a journey of their own experience. And if you're there listening to that, if you're there kind of holding that safely just through nodding and smiling and saying, I'm here, I'm listening, it can really, over a number of days, really change the fabric of that relationship overall. And I think it's the reciprocity of sharing and greeting that can really help with that. And we find that over 10 days, there is some change, but also that can continue in terms of the pattern that you have together. I wanted to just take note of the second point, routine. So following community trauma, the nervous system is really set into overdrive. And just to remind you, the #1 operating system for our body and our nervous system is to keep us safe, and it will override everything else: learning, cognition, social engagement. It's really about safety. And when there's a flood, when there's a bushfire, or as I said earlier, an invisible virus like COVID floating around, it makes it really hard for children, young people, and even adults to trust our environment. But routine sets up that familiarity and that predictability, which over time allows a child to find a pattern that they can trust. And just to note, this is a huge strength of learning communities and educators as well. The fourth point, and I'll try not to get too passionate about the third point here, movement. As an OT, that's something that we really do encourage. The body will naturally find ways of regulating itself. I'm here doing a presentation. I can't see any of your faces, but I'm trying to regulate myself by slightly turning in my chair, and the body will naturally do things that will help it to feel calm and in that green zone that I referenced. Particularly movement through the muscles and the joints, so the proprioceptive system in the body. So find ways of feeding that need, find short movement breaks into the day that can help children and young people move back into that window of tolerance. And again, this doesn't have to be a complex movement. Chair push-ups are a great example for children and young people, where you can do it in your chair just by having your hands underneath. I won't show you guys, but you can have your hands underneath your chair, and pushing up and down off the chair can be a really fun and engaging way to get movement while not leaving the classroom or your chair as well. So you can tune into that yourselves about movement and what you can incorporate into your day. And the final point there is around emotional regulation. And I think this is a really important point, because we need to find ways of supporting children's emotions following a community trauma. And what we know is that behavior is often shown in the form of communication, where there's some deep emotions there. We can naturally feel heightened when there is emotion shared. So acknowledge that for yourself. But simply by connecting with whatever's present with you in that child can have really important impacts for them processing those emotions. So if a child's sad, finding ways of connecting with them in an empathetic way around that, or naming that emotion, it can naturally help to regulate it. I think that's a good thing for you to be curious about yourselves. And I think noticing that even if you can name an emotion in yourself when you're feeling something, it can help to, what they say, down regulate that emotion as well. And another approach which is really crucial for children is learning their own tools to self-regulate. And I think something like mindfulness is a really good approach that can help children to be with emotions, as well as choosing the tools like the breath to support their own regulation. So the next slide we're going to look at is monitoring. And educators have a really key position in monitoring children's mental health following a community trauma, and particularly identifying children who have ongoing difficulties. And a good way of thinking about this is looking at child mental health on a continuum. So where down one end of the continuum is positive mental health, where the majority of children do sit within. But as certain vulnerabilities happen, whether they're developmental or certain adversities in their life, children can have certain vulnerabilities which impact them and potentially might cause some functional difficulties in one aspect of their life. But children can also move down to the furthest end of that continuum, where there's more pervasive and persistent symptoms that affect them across multiple contexts at school, home, and in the community. So just being aware that this is dynamic for children and they move up and down throughout their life, and particularly in the context of community trauma, it becomes important that educators have tools that they can use to observe that. And the Beatles tool, the observation tool through BU, is a great tool that a lot of learning communities have found and educators have found effective. It stands for looking at the behaviours, looking at emotions, looking at thoughts, looking at learning and social engagement. I know that's a lot of words and it could sound like that's overwhelming, but it's quite a simple tool that you can use to help map out changes in behaviour, as well as looking at kind of what certain triggers might be there in the environment or what helps to support that child's mental health as well. So I know there's a link to this in the show notes as well. So over to you, Brad, to look at activating support.
Thanks for that, Ben. And I think just building on what Ben's been talking about, particularly around the unique role educators and people in the learning community have in really understanding how children are going in their daily life in the learning community. One of the things that might need to happen is you might need to find extra help and support for the child or the young person. And I think this is often what we hear is quite a challenge for educators. I think for a whole range of professions, I think there seems to be quite a challenge. And one of the things I think that I think can be quite tricky is knowing where to go and who to get for different types of issues. And I think something that's really important in this sort of thing is that knowledge and wisdom that you have been able to gather around the young person. I think that's something we sort of look at, and what Ben was highlighting there is you do have a really unique opportunity in monitoring children over time and understanding, you know, things are changing. There might be slow changes that you might have sort of reflected on that, yeah, things have changed over the last few months, or it might be something quite significant and change really quickly. And so some of the things that we really encourage in relation to activating support is using that wisdom and knowledge that you have. And I tend to think of this sort of thing as when you're activating support is think about how do you get the situational experts or people who know what's happening together to be able to share that knowledge around what do we need to do, what are the contexts that it's happening in. So in the context of if a child or a young person you're observing was struggling, really the first step is really being curious, and you know you'll have your observations and notes and understandings of what's happening, and the next step is sort of to go, is this just happening in the classroom or is this happening elsewhere? And so how do you find out a bit more about that is in one instance it might be talking to the young person around, oh, I've just noticed these things are happening and some of these changes. And what you're seeking to explore and being able to activate that support is understand what their perspective is on it and what the context of what you might have observed and if they share those observations. The other part of being curious is where possible is really trying to connect with and collaborate with parents around, I think what Ben was mentioning before, is this something that's just happening in the school context, or is this happening at home, or is this happening in other places as well? Or it might be the other way around where you haven't made no observations at all. Think maybe they're going really well at school, but maybe parents have come to you saying, we've just noticed things happening at home and we're just wondering if you've got the same sort of experience. And the real idea around activating support is to be able to share each other's wisdom around what to do next and problem solve or plan together around what might be the next steps. And I think quite often we want to automatically jump to getting, you know, really specialist support, and sometimes that is important and necessary, but other times, particularly looking at the mental health continuum, there can be things that can be done even just in your relationship or in your room, or even just sort of sharing information that can really be prevention support. So might be stepping in early and going, let's just do some simple problem solving things here and now and what they can do to prevent things from getting worse. And then there's other times when you might need to really do activate specialist support, and those supports are places where you might go, and schools generally have access to those, but things like, you know, I think there's headspace supports for young people, there's going to the general practice, most areas have access to things like child and adolescent mental health services, so those sorts of supports are there, but I think sometimes we often jump straight to them rather than thinking about what other things can be offered in the first instance and moving towards them. So some of the things I sort of think about as useful is thinking about what types of support are useful. And sometimes that can be just providing information and having access to that information, as you would all have access to, is lots of different tools and things that you find useful. And for some people, that just gives information to help them maybe even help understand if it is or whether it is a problem or a challenge. Other sorts of support that can be offered is, for some people, they might just need some extra tips or tools that might be there. And I sort of think of those as self-directed strategies. So things like apps and fact sheets or guides that are available, and you can make available to families and young people as well. The other types of support that are available is thinking about activating support networks. And support networks I tend to think of as there's our natural supports, and how do you communicate and help them to understand that this is something that we're worried about and we're wondering if you could help us with this. And that might be, family, friends, those sorts of things, or for in the learning community, it might be other colleagues and things as well that you can activate. But it can also be those more specialist supports if that's what's needed as well. So going to helping people go to the GP and helping them prepare for that, maybe helping them prepare and connect with a service, or if you've got access to counsellors or school support services as well, is just looking at how that can be activated. And something that's really important through that whole process, as I was mentioning before, is if possible trying to collaborate with the network. So that could be the young person, it could be their parents, it could be the child. And sort of helping them to sort of really set an agenda around what is the challenge we're experiencing here, what are we worried about, but also to acknowledge the strengths in that sort of space as well. And the idea, I think, is always trying to look at how do we empower people to find the support they need and activate the support they need as well, and that includes supporting young people to do that as well. And just to give you a bit of a quick orientation, I thought might be some things that might be useful to take away from today. It's just some tools that are available for you that might assist in helping you in your understanding and sort of thinking about how you might feel more confident responding to trauma. The first thing I'll share with you is just similar to the BU initiative, Emerging Minds also has a range of online learning materials. And I think a lot of our work is really looking at those that sort of work in health and social services. And I think if you're looking at a learning community, we know there's counsellors and other people that are involved, like speech pathologists, occupational therapists, that get connected. And so a lot of the work we've got is a lot of tools that will help those sort of groups. And when our learning, we sort of have designed really to be focused on where you work really matters for what role you play. So if you log into our system, you'll sort of see there's a different option to say, if I'm an educator, there's a specific set of courses for you. If I'm working in child protection, there's another different set of courses for you as well. And all of those aim to help initially build some understanding of, what is child mental health and social emotional wellbeing, what is trauma, how do I engage and communicate in trauma sensitive ways. And then depending on where you work would be then looking at the different types of, I guess, what we'd consider your scope of practice. So for people that, aren't working in health and social services, we don't expect you to be delivering interventions, but there's things that you can do, like sharing information, and there's tools like that that can help you do that, or how to have a conversation with a child or a young person, or how to talk with parents about things. So so that's something that's available for free and would be available there if you want to use it, and you can share with your teams. The other resources I wanted to share with you as well is particularly relevant for this work is a community trauma toolkit that's also freely available. And this has been released in the last, just before the bushfires actually, so it's been around for about 12 to 18 months. And really this toolkit was designed in response to, I guess, a recognition of often children being a bit invisible in the context of, natural disasters or community traumas, and a real need to sort of create a central place where people can access materials that help them in their response to children and young people. And so the way the toolkit's sort of designed is we sort of know from community trauma that there's some common principles irrespective of the trauma. So, it could be a bushfire, it could be a flood, it could be terrorism or community violence that we've been exposed to, or in the context of now looking at a pandemic. And really common principles apply across all of those things. So what Ben was talking about today, those sorts of principles can apply irrespective of the nature of the trauma. Obviously, there's different explanations and things that come across with all of those. But really this toolkit is aiming to do that. And we've sort of designed it both to be responsive and targeted for different groups, which you can see on there. So educators, general practitioners, health and social services, and there's a suite of resources which can include things like workshop presentations and that you can use yourselves. So running a workshop, podcast, fact sheets, those sorts of things. And they're designed around sort of looking at preparedness. So getting ready, if you live in an area where there is, bushfires or cyclones or those sorts of things, getting ready. How to respond in the immediate. So when we talk about immediate is when it's happening or in the days after, and then short-term responses, which is, a few weeks afterwards, and then in the long term, which can be sort of the months and years that follow that. So there's lots of resources available there for those different audiences. And the other resources that are available on the Emerging Minds website that I thought I'd just draw some attention to. There's lots there, but is some resources that you might like to share with parents, families and carers. And ones that I wanted to draw your attention to in particular are there's fact sheets and things like that. Which sort of, I guess in the context of now, we've got some fact sheets on, as a parent, how do I talk about what's happening? So that at home in relation to COVID and parenting and what's changed in our family. So there's some things like that that just help guide discussions. But the other tool that we've shared with a lot of families, and I think with a lot of educators who are sharing it with families, is an app that we've developed called Child 360. And really what it is it's a really simple tool that I guess what we've heard from parents, but also from professionals, is it can be quite tricky to be able to, I guess, sort of unpack what's happening for children and what's always happening in children. And there's a range of strengths and there's a range of things that we might be worried about. And so it just helps to simplify and think about and reflect on, things aren't going so well here, but they're going okay here. What do I need to do to activate support? And it sort of reflects what I said similar. In the first instance, it might be that I just want more information, so it helps you find more information on that particular topic. It might also be that actually, no, I might need to talk to someone, so it provides information on who to contact around this particular issue. Or if it's something that is of concern, it actually can generate a bit of an agenda or a letter that you can take to your GP or a child maternal health nurse or whoever it is you're seeking support from to really help frame an agenda for when I have my appointment. These are the things I'm really worried about and would like further discussion with. So that's just something I think we've been sharing with parents, and I think educators in particular have said it's been a really good tool to help parents really reflect on what's happening for their children as well and seek the help that they need. And there's another one that we're just about to release, which is really called another app, which is called When I'm Away. And it's really for parents around how they can set up plans for when they might be separated from their children for, a few days, or which might be planned, but it might also be when it's unplanned. How do we communicate the information about how our children are going and what they need to other people who might be responsible for looking after them as well. And that sort of is finishing up really our sort of more presentation part of the presentation today. But I think just reflecting on what's been covered, what Ben's been talking through and what I've been able to share is something we really wanted to get across to learning communities is really recognising that support for children following community trauma isn't only about programs and specialists. And I think that's just really reinforcing how important learning communities are for children's recovery. And I think quite often we pay a lot of attention to, activating all the specialist supports that you might get from, allied health professionals and medical professionals. But I really want to highlight that the most important actions that happen to support recovery are those that become integrated in the everyday life of children. And in particular, as in the context of your role, is those that occur in the everyday life of the learning community. They don't need to be sort of big and extensive magical things. I think as Ben's sort of talking about, it's just those moments in everyday learning and in the community that make a real big difference to our recovery. But it's also to sort of look at, you have a really unique role in being able to understand how children are progressing over time. There's not many other relationships in a child or young person's life which is consistent and continuing over time. And so for that reason, you do have that really unique opportunity to go, actually, how are children progressing and the changes that happen over in a few weeks, a month, a year. And that's sort of a really important role that you play.
Thank you so much, Brad and Ben. It was just so informative, but I really love that take-home message of we don't need those really complicated or expensive even outside programs. Just sometimes what educators are no doubt doing, on a day-to-day basis, that's so supportive in those small kind of everyday actions. I really like that take-home message. I'm really conscious of time and that we've had some really great questions come through in the chat box. So with we'll get straight to some of those. Heidi, I hope you don't mind. I'm going to throw straight to you for this question. So how can we stay connected as a community sorry, that was the second question. How do we support our students returning to school? Oh, and Heidi, I think you're on mute. This is the year of Zoom, and unmute, that's it, yeah.
It's reiterating that point of that Ben made about just having that really safe and welcoming space. A classroom needs to feel safe, so don't underestimate the power of a smile as a teacher. Listen with interest, interact with your students. Teachers could be also really good role models in staying calm and steady. And if you're feeling heightened, ask for help. Acknowledge that students, that they're feeling loss and fear, and provide reassurance that their thoughts are really normal and things get better over time. It's also good to provide students with a safe space to talk, and that can be in a class environment or one-on-one. Some may not want to talk and they might like to just express themselves in different ways, and that could be writing, drama, music, art, and for young children that could be through creative play. The routines are really important as well, so maintaining those really strong routines. The students of Strathewen Primary School, they lost their school over in the Black Saturday fires, and they set up their school in a makeshift classroom in a neighbouring school, and they wanted their readers, they wanted spelling lists. It was that normal known to them that there's so much security in routines. In classrooms, have their classroom schedule displayed, and if things need to be changed, then discuss that with the students. It's good to have a yard duty roster on display in the classroom, so children can have that safe person to find on yard duty if they need it. For older students, giving plenty of notice for assignments due and tests and that sort of thing, and you might need to give that message in a number of different ways, like email, verbal. And also just reiterating Ben and Brad's point about monitoring students' behaviour and activating support. And the Notice Inquire provide modules in the BU framework is really valuable, and that Beatles tool to record those observed behaviours.
Yeah, thanks, Heidi. Just those simple reminders, isn't it, about how important a routine can be in terms, and just how safe that can be for our young people as well.
Absolutely.
Ben, I hope you don't mind. I'm going to throw this next question to you because I think it's actually really just so relevant, I suppose, with what we're all navigating at the moment. How can we stay connected as a community during prolonged periods of social distancing and loss of human contact?
Yeah, it's a great question, Ruth. It's kind of counterintuitive for the body, isn't it, what we've had to go through in the nervous system, because we're innately built to connect with each other, and we rely on the kind of, as I talked about, the reciprocity of sharing, and it's energizing for us most of the time. And yeah, when we're disconnected, it's finding those ways to connect, and that can happen in a couple of different ways. I guess the prosody of our voice is one of those, and how no matter, even if you're using video conferencing with kids, I know most schools are going back at the moment, but we can connect through the tone of our voice. Even our affect and expression can help connect with each other. Things like email and texting and writing is a bit tricky because you miss out on all the social cues, but I think finding the ways that we can connect is obviously a strengths-based approach, but acknowledging that it's a tough time. It's unprecedented what we've gone through and going through. So staying as connected to those that you can connect with is another approach that that you can draw on. So yeah, could probably talk more on that, but I think that's probably a good starting place.
Yeah, that's a very big question, isn't it? And we could spend another whole in focus on that one just alone. Brad, this is one that again is probably it's a bigger question, and I'm wondering if you'll be able to answer it in a succinct way. But what's about the adults who have suffered immense trauma, for example, the teacher, and if they're triggered but they need to hold it together?
Yeah. Well, I think this is, as you said, a very big question, and I think this is something I sort of draw on around this is a lot of lessons we've learned from the work we've done, particularly looking at parents with a mental illness as well. And I think probably from a first perspective is, of course, it's okay and that's expected that you would have experienced some of this and you would be triggered by this. And I think for the first thing is just to be kind to yourself and actually say to yourself, that's actually okay for me to feel that way. Because I think often we can get quite caught up in guilt about that sort of area. But I think in relation to, I guess, our role in supporting children and young people, which is sort of where I sort of would pay a lot more attention as well, is thinking about what the experience of what the young person or the child or young person's experienced in relation to, if you aren't feeling so good. I sort of would go, yep, when I'm tired or stressed, I tend to be a bit grumpier, a bit quieter, or a bit angrier. My fuse is a bit shorter. And sometimes that results in me, for example, not being and relating to people the way I want to. And for children and young people, something they're particularly sensitive to is our anger and our hostility. So particularly when we're stressed, that's something that I'd say is particularly sensitive. And it's not to say that I think children have probably been exposed to a lot of family hostility this year just because of the nature of what we've been through, but is to actually be kind and forgive ourselves for that sort of work, but is not to just stop there and forgive ourselves. It's actually to pay attention to how do I repair what's been done. And for us as adults, we can take leadership in relationships and model to children that, sometimes we do damage relationships when we haven't been behaving or relating to people in a way that we probably want to be. And so it's sort of explaining that sometimes, and that can be as simple as, when I have been grumpy with my kids because I've had a bad day at work and I'm burnt out, it's just explaining to them, I'm sorry, I was a bit grumpy yesterday. It's not what you've done. It's just that I had a really tough day. And it's the same, I think, as adults, if we can take that opportunity. That's sort of what I call good emotional literacy, building in and of itself is, as an educator, you might have had a really bad day and, you might have just been a bit grumpier that day with one children in the whole classroom. And every now and then it might actually be okay to actually say and model that, yeah, sorry about that morning session. I just had a really stressful start to the day and I'm going to try, I've had a bit of a break and now I'm sort of trying to work on that, but just actually labeling that for them, because it's the sort of labeling we want children to do as well, because that's good for repairing those relationships. But I think also for children, it helps them make sense of, when adults are a bit different. And that's really important for them in their own development, because children tend to absorb that and blame themselves. I think that's something that what we can do to buffer against some of that internalizing, I guess you'd call, of what they've seen around them, is to help them just make sense of that as well. And I think what Ben's been saying today as well is, just checking in. And I think some of the cues that I sort of go is, I think Ben was talking a lot about our emotional effect and how we might be able to just be conscious of that and what we might do in our everyday life to do that. But the other thing I sort of think about is also the language we use. Sometimes when we are, tired or stressed, you can often use more extreme language or express, what might be grey might actually be black and white. So just being conscious of the language you can use in that space as well.
And that's just, I suppose it speaks to that power of that you can repair after, and I think that's so true for children and young people, isn't it? That even if they've been dysregulated, they actually can repair that and come back and join their classmates or join the room. Like that's, the power of that repair work is so important. Heidi, we've probably got time for one more question. I'll just throw this one to you. What are some practical strategies to support kids who are impacted by trauma in the classroom?
Okay, so it's really great for them to have a designated space to have that time out to regain that emotional control. And that can be a staffed interception room or a breakout room or a corner of the classroom with cushions, and where they can just have a moment and gather their thoughts before they come back and join the classroom. It's really good to maintain firm limits and expectations of behaviour. Just because there's been trauma doesn't mean that that needs to change. The stop, think, do model that's been around for years is a really great tool to use for trauma affected students. Empowering the students with student voice and getting them to be a part of the curriculum, and not just in the classroom meetings but provide choices is, you know, really engaging and a proactive way to keep them feeling as though you know, they're a part of their class and, you know, are important. Understand also that trauma can affect concentration. So with it might just mean lessons may need to be adjusted, have really clear expectations, which most teachers would anyway, break the task down and scaffold those tasks really well, vary the mode of working, like in pairs, in partners, that's the same thing, in groups, have quiet time and have interactive time, just to keep those levels of concentration higher. Pitch the lessons so that they're challenging but achievable and more achievable. Give supportive and clear feedback, which, you know, teachers do well anyway. Introducing brain breaks. Brain breaks are great when primary school teachers use them really well, by energizing, you know, dancing, singing, yoga, or a quick run or walk outside, or the calming brain breaks where you can do a Smiling Minds app or some guided deep breathing. And also preparing the students for those times that they might be triggered. So after a community trauma like a bushfire, there might be fire drills, which are, you know, schools are legally mandated to hold. Rather than just having the fire drill, having a lesson beforehand and discussing what they might hear and see and feel, and what sort of inner dialogue could they have when they are feeling heightened with that fire drill, like, I'm safe, I'm here with my class. You know, just preparing them beforehand is really important. And even the first couple of fire drills, rather than having, you know, because often a school will say, right, we'll have a fire drill on Friday and you don't know when it's coming. For the first one, maybe have it at a set time so that they know, and that element of surprise is taken away. And also focusing on the strengths and positives of the students, and reinforcing great behaviours, and recognising when they're being resilient and managing their emotions and are problem solving and being kind to others. And in the context of a community trauma, it's so important to celebrate the helpers rather than focusing on the devastation. Celebrating the helpers, the CFS volunteers, the police, the medical staff. Yeah, I think that's really important.
Such a lovely point.
Yeah, and what just prioritising self-care for educators is super important.
Very important, isn't it? That's, yeah, one of our big key take-home messages. I'd just really like to thank the three of you. Thank you so much for all your time and energy and insight into this topic. I know that many of us know that there's a lot of work that goes on behind the scenes to get an In Focus like this up and running. So I really appreciate all the effort and time, energy, and yeah, especially the time that you've put in. So thank you so much for sharing your expertise today. I know we're quickly running out of time, so I just wanted to really touch on a couple of the BU resources that we've spoken about today. So in the resources tab on the website, there's some fantastic fact sheets that you can go to. I spoke about them earlier, that they have some really specific topics that you can download if you don't want to go through the whole module. They're a great way just to kind of even have a discussion as a staff group. Really importantly, Heidi, I think Ben spoke about it, Brad spoke about it. We, really want to emphasise educator wellbeing as well. The website's really clearly broken down into, they've got a wellbeing tools for you section, and it's really clearly broken down into how you can get your information, some apps or activities that you might want to practice to promote wellbeing for you, but also importantly where you can also seek help to communicate in terms of that communication and taking that a step further. So if you are looking to have a bit more information about what resources are on offer, or you'd like to kind of get a bit more information about BU, I'd really encourage you to jump on the website. Really can't stress enough that you've got a consultant there for you to be able to access, and they're a great resource just to be able to show you through the website, show you what tools and resources are available, but also help you, I suppose, tailor it to your own learning community needs, and what might be kind of useful for your learning community might not necessarily be useful for another learning community. So the consultant can really help you navigate all those different nuances. Just really quickly, as you leave today, you'll be asked to complete a really short survey. We'd really appreciate if you could fill that out. It just helps us to be able to gauge what sessions you might want to have in the future, or what topics that you kind of keen to look at in the future. And just lastly, thank you so much for your time. I really know how precious educators' time is, and it's the end of the day, so thank you for joining us. Just a reminder that you will get a certificate for participating in today's webinar, and you also get a post-webinar email with all the resources that we've shared today. So and again, a reminder that this has been recorded. It will be on the website in about 2 weeks, so keep an eye out for that. And please, just a reminder to check out Emerging Minds website and look at some of those resources that Brad and Ben have talked about. But that's all from me. Thank you so much for joining us, and have a wonderful Thursday evening.